All right, let me ask you something. What happens when the greatest driver of his generation walks into the most storied team in Formula One history and essentially tells them everything you've been doing? Yeah, we need to rethink that. Because according to multiple credible reports and sources inside the paddock, that is more or less what has been unfolding at Maranello since Lewis Hamilton made arguably the most shocking career move in motorsport history. And here's the part that most people aren't talking about. It's not just that Hamilton joined Ferrari, it's that Ferrari, one of the most tradition-guarded institutions in all of sports, appears to have genuinely, structurally, and technically reshaped itself around one man's feedback. Not just the car setup, not just the seat position. We are talking suspension geometry, engine braking philosophy, steering wheel layout, engineering team structure, and even simulator protocols, all reportedly overhauled because Lewis Hamilton said things were not working for him. Now, I want to be clear from the start. Not all of this is officially confirmed by Ferrari in public statements, and I will flag what is reported versus what is verified as we go through this. But the picture that is emerging, based on reporting from multiple motorsport insiders and technical analysts who cover this paddock closely, is genuinely remarkable. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why Ferrari's 2026 car, the SF26, may be the most Lewis Hamilton-shaped piece of engineering in the entire history of this sport. And the question I want you to keep in mind throughout all of this is one that nobody has cleanly answered yet. Did Ferrari bend to Hamilton, or did Hamilton finally give Ferrari what they desperately needed to actually win a championship again? Let's go back to the beginning of this story, because the context matters enormously here. When Hamilton's move to Ferrari was announced, and honestly, the announcement broke the internet, I remember being genuinely stunned, sitting there reading the headline twice because it didn't seem real. The narrative was romantic. 7-time world champion, iconic red car, sunset chapter of a legendary career, poetic, beautiful, done. The kind of move that gets made into a film eventually. But what followed in the 2025 season was, by most accounts, anything but romantic. Sources following the team's development trajectory have described the 2025 campaign, built around the SF25, as a period of significant technical friction, not because of personalities or locker room politics, though Formula One always has those in abundance and always will, but because of something far more technical and frankly far more interesting to anyone who genuinely loves this sport. See, by the time Hamilton arrived at Maranello, the SF25 had already been designed, developed, and locked in. The aerodynamic philosophy, the suspension setup, the ride height parameters, the braking map, all of it was essentially set in stone before Hamilton had driven a single competitive lap for the team. And it turns out that car was built around a philosophy that was almost the exact opposite of what Hamilton had spent over a decade perfecting and refining at Mercedes. That mismatch, according to sources tracking the team's internal data and development path, caused some serious on-track headaches that went well beyond what was visible to the outside world watching on television. So what exactly was going wrong? Here is where it gets technically fascinating, and I promise I will keep this understandable even if you do not have an engineering background. Ferrari, in their bid to extract maximum aerodynamic performance from the SF25, had reportedly opted for an extremely aggressive low ride height setup. Now, for those who are not deep into the technical weeds of Formula One, and honestly most people are not, and that is perfectly fine, ride height refers to how close the floor of the car runs to the ground during cornering and straight line running. The closer you run it, the more ground effect downforce you generate from underneath the car, and downforce is essentially everything in modern Formula One. It is what keeps the car glued to the road at speeds that would otherwise have the thing airborne. The problem is that running that close to the ground comes with brutal trade-offs that teams are constantly fighting. Reports suggest the SF25's floor was under extreme stress at such low clearances, leading to increased wear on the car's plank, the wooden strip that regulations require to run along the bottom of the car at a minimum thickness. And if that plank wears below the legal limit during a race weekend, you're looking at disqualification from the results. That is not a hypothetical. According to reports, Ferrari reportedly faced mid-season regulatory issues precisely related to this kind of wear, which is not the kind of headline any team managing a world championship bid wants to be dealing with when they should be focused entirely on lap time. And that's just the regulatory side. On the pure performance side, sources claim that the low ride height philosophy created a car that was fundamentally at odds with Hamilton's driving style. And this is the part I find most compelling, because it reveals just how specific and precise a top-level Formula One driver's technical demands really are. Hamilton, across his years at Mercedes, had developed an extraordinarily refined approach to braking. His technique relies heavily on a very particular feel at the front of the car, a progressive, communicative, almost conversational relationship with the brake pedal that gives him the confidence to push right to the absolute limit of what the car can do under extreme deceleration. It's one of the things that separates genuinely great drivers from merely very good ones, the ability to trust the car completely at the point where most people would instinctively ease.
According to sources tracking his feedback sessions during the 2025 season, the SF25's braking characteristics were described internally as providing insufficient front-end confidence for Hamilton's technique, leading to episodes of instability and locking that reportedly cost him both outright pace and consistency across race distances. And look, I want to be genuinely fair here. Every driver going to a new team faces an adaptation period. That is completely normal. Nico Rosberg admitted struggling when Hamilton first arrived at Mercedes and turned the team's dynamic upside down. Fernando Alonso went through adjustment periods at virtually every team he drove for. But sources suggest the issues Hamilton faced with the SF25 went meaningfully beyond a typical settling-in phase and were more fundamentally tied to the car's underlying design philosophy, rather than simply being a matter of Hamilton needing more time. Add to that the reports of significant simulator correlation problems, meaning Ferrari's virtual testing tools were apparently not accurately predicting what the car would actually do once it was out on a real racetrack, and you have a scenario where the team's entire upgrade development path was being compromised before the upgrades even got built. You are essentially navigating with a broken compass, patches on patches on patches. It is the kind of cascading technical situation that makes senior engineers lose sleep and makes team principals give very carefully worded non-answers at press conferences. Now, here's where the story takes the turn that really grabbed my attention and made me want to go deep on this. Rather than simply adapting himself to fit Ferrari's existing system, which, given Hamilton's age and the genuinely limited number of competitive seasons remaining at the sharp end of Formula One, would arguably have been the path of least resistance, sources suggest Hamilton and his side of the garage essentially made a structured, data-driven case for rethinking the entire approach ahead of the 2026 regulation cycle. And crucially, it appears Ferrari listened. Not just listened, acted. Not with words and press releases, with actual structural and technical change. And when I say acted, I mean they reportedly fundamentally restructured core aspects of their technical operation in ways that rarely happen inside the walls of Maranello. The timing here is absolutely critical to understanding why this was possible. The 2026 Formula One season represents the most sweeping regulatory overhaul the sport has seen in many years. New aerodynamic rules, new power unit regulations, smaller and lighter cars, the introduction of active aerodynamics, bodywork that actually moves while the car is running. It is a genuine clean sheet moment for every team on the grid, a rare chance to throw out inherited assumptions and start fresh. And Ferrari, according to sources with visibility into their engineering operations, chose to use that clean sheet moment not just to build a faster car in the abstract, but to build a car that is specifically, deliberately, and extensively shaped around what Lewis Hamilton needs to perform at his absolute best in a Formula One race car. Let me walk you through what that reportedly looks like in practice, because the details are genuinely surprising and, in some cases, unprecedented. Start with the suspension. Sources claim that Ferrari chassis technical director Loic Serra, a figure who has quietly become one of the most important people in Formula One's technical landscape, even if his name does not come up as much in mainstream coverage as it should, worked directly and extensively with Hamilton's feedback sessions and engineering discussions to completely overhaul both the front and rear suspension architectures. Now, Loic Serra is a name worth knowing if you follow this sport seriously. He's the kind of engineer who operates in the background, who does not do many press interviews, but whose fingerprints consistently show up in championship design decisions. The direction he and Hamilton reportedly agreed upon addresses two of the most consistent complaints from Hamilton's debut season:
Chronic understeer in medium and high-speed corners and high-speed instability that was reportedly undermining Hamilton's willingness to commit fully in the areas of the circuit that decide lap time. Understeer, for anyone not familiar, is when the front of the car does not want to turn as sharply as the driver demands. It's the automotive equivalent of trying to change direction quickly while your feet are sliding. It's manageable at lower speeds and for drivers whose style accommodates it, but for Hamilton's precise front-end trusting technique, it's apparently maddening and fundamentally limits what he can extract from the car. The revised suspension geometry on the SF26, according to reports, is specifically calibrated to provide the front of the car with more initial rotational bite, more willingness to turn aggressively into corners when Hamilton makes his input, which aligns with his style of committing early to the apex and trusting the front end to respond, rather than compensating with understeer. Whether those geometry changes translate into the lap time that matters for a championship across 24 race weekends, that remains the actual test that no simulator can fully predict. The suspension overhaul is striking enough on its own, but the suspension story is just the beginning of what sources are describing. Let's talk about engine braking, because this is where things get genuinely intricate and the reported intervention goes deeper than most people realize. Engine braking in Formula One refers to the deceleration effect that the power unit creates when the driver lifts off the throttle approaching a braking zone. Think of it as the engine itself acting as a retarding force on the rear wheels during the transition from full throttle to heavy braking. Teams can map this effect across a spectrum from very aggressive to very gentle, and the setting has a massive cascading impact on how the car rotates into a corner, how stable it feels under deceleration,
How much the rear steps out or holds firm, and how much work the driver is required to do with the brake pedal itself to manage the car's balance through the braking phase. According to sources, Hamilton's feedback to Ferrari engineers was explicit and consistent. The existing engine braking setup was too aggressive for his technique, creating unpredictability at corner entry that made it difficult for him to find the consistent reference points that he relies on to extract maximum performance lap after lap, including deep into race distances when tyre degradation changes the car's behaviour. The reported solution was a comprehensive remap of the power unit's engine braking characteristics, moving toward a smoother and more progressive response that gives Hamilton what engineers call a wider operating window, more consistency, more predictability, more room to push without the car punishing him for minor variations in technique or tyre condition. What is particularly notable, according to analysts who track Ferrari's development narrative closely, is that this was not simply a software parameter adjustment that could be reversed next race weekend. It reportedly influenced how Ferrari structured power unit mapping strategy for the SF26 more fundamentally and more permanently. One driver's very specific technical feedback reportedly reshaping how an entire power unit philosophy is deployed in competition. That is a significant decision, with implications that extend well beyond any single race weekend. And then there is the steering wheel. I know that sounds almost mundane compared to everything we have discussed so far, suspension overhauls, engine braking revisions, but stay with me, because in Formula One, the steering wheel is the primary interface between the driver's intentions and the machine's responses, and for the 2026 season, that interface has reportedly been comprehensively rethought. The 2026 regulations introduce active aerodynamics, movable bodywork that the driver can adjust in real time to balance downforce and drag depending on circuit section, on top of the already extraordinarily complex energy management demands of the hybrid power unit, plus race strategy inputs, tyre management decisions, and the basic business of driving a Formula One car at the absolute limit around streets and circuits while competitors are trying to pass you or defend against you. Managing all of that simultaneously through a steering wheel while cornering at 200 kilometers per hour and absorbing physical forces that would put most people in a medical facility is an extraordinary cognitive and physical demand, even by Formula One standards.
According to sources with insight into Ferrari's driver interface development program, Hamilton's feedback during simulator testing specifically and repeatedly highlighted the complexity overload problem and pushed for a deliberate consolidation and simplification of control inputs. The reported result is a steering wheel layout on the SF26 that reorganizes energy management and active aerodynamic controls specifically to reduce driver cognitive workload, freeing up mental bandwidth for Hamilton to focus on what actually moves the lap timer rather than spending mental capacity managing systems that could be better organized. That is a subtle change that sounds like a detail, but across a season of racing, reducing driver overload at critical moments is a potentially meaningful performance differentiator. Now I want to address the structural change that, in my personal view, might actually be the most consequential piece of this entire story, and I think it tends to be underreported precisely because it is not as visually dramatic as active aerodynamics or redesigned suspension geometries. According to sources tracking Ferrari's internal engineering organisation, the team restructured the personnel in Hamilton's side of the garage in a specific and deliberate manner. Most notably, Ferrari reportedly brought in a performance engineer who had previously worked with Hamilton during his championship years at Mercedes. Now think carefully about what that means in genuine practice, because it is not just a feel-good personnel story. A performance engineer at this level of Formula One is not primarily running spreadsheets. They are the primary technical conduit between what the driver experiences and feels inside the car and what the broader engineering team needs to hear in order to make meaningful development decisions. They translate the driver's highly subjective sensory feedback, the language of feel, instinct, confidence, and discomfort, into the objective engineering language that shapes which direction the car develops. Having someone in that role who already has years of history with Hamilton, who already understands his reference points, his priorities, his communication style, and his way of describing what he needs from a car, compresses the adaptation timeline dramatically. The months that a typical driver-engineer pairing might spend simply establishing a shared vocabulary and calibrating expectations can instead be spent actually developing the car in a productive direction. That kind of institutional knowledge transfer, reportedly engineered deliberately by Ferrari management rather than happening by accident, suggests a depth of commitment to making this partnership work that goes well beyond the public-facing statements about excitement and fresh starts. The simulator correlation issue also reportedly received serious and sustained attention, and while this part of the story is less glamorous than anything involving aerodynamics or driver feedback, it is arguably the most important infrastructure investment Ferrari could make for long-term competitiveness. Ferrari's simulator, like those operated by all top Formula One teams at enormous expense, is used to predict how proposed upgrades will perform before the team commits the substantial resources required to manufacture, ship and test them at an actual race weekend. If the simulator is telling your engineers that a new front wing will deliver, for example, 0.3 of a lap time improvement, and then that front wing arrives at the track and delivers essentially nothing, you have not just wasted the cost of that specific part, you have wasted the engineering hours spent designing it, the manufacturing time spent building it, the logistics of getting it to the track, and most critically, you have pointed your entire development program in a direction that resources are unpredictable. And the institutional knowledge gap that was left behind at Mercedes is equally part of the story, because it is just as important to understand the cost of that transfer for that team. Mercedes lost someone who understood Hamilton's reference points intimately, someone who was calibrated to what Hamilton needed from a technical perspective. That kind of transfer of institutional knowledge doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time to rebuild that kind of trust, that kind of understanding. And the economic and social costs of that transfer for Mercedes, I think, are also important. Because it is not just about losing an engineer, it is about losing a specific set of connections, a specific way of working together, a fluidness of communication that is hard to replicate. And in the ultra-competitive world of Formula One, any loss of that institutional knowledge can be seen as a balance shift. What they gained at Ferrari, they lost at Mercedes, and the implications of that for the upcoming season are enormous. It's the silent but equally significant shift in institutional capital that teams are constantly navigating in their quest for consistent performance.
Was incorrect. Repeated instances of that kind of simulation mismatch create organizational confusion and erode confidence in the development process itself. According to reports, Hamilton's engineering team identified specific areas where Ferrari's simulator model of how the car behaves at the limit did not match what Hamilton was actually experiencing on track during the 2025 season, and systematically fed that discrepancy data back into the team's simulation protocols to refine the model's accuracy. Better simulator correlation means better development efficiency, fewer dead ends, faster iteration cycles, smarter resource allocation across a season. It will not win you a race by itself, but it raises the probability that the upgrades you bring to the next race are the right upgrades. That kind of compounding efficiency advantage is how championships are actually built over 24 race weekends. So let me step back from the technical specifics for a moment and offer some broader perspective, because I think the larger picture here is genuinely worth reflecting on beyond just the engineering details. Ferrari has existed as a Formula One constructor since 1950. They have won more races, more championships, and generated more passion among fans than any other team in the history of the sport. They have their own way of doing things, their own deeply rooted culture, their own internal hierarchy, their own engineering philosophy, and that culture is famous, sometimes notoriously so, for being resistant to external influence. The history of Ferrari is littered with cases of extraordinarily talented drivers, engineers, and managers who arrived at Maranello with strong ideas and strong track records and found themselves eventually bending to the Ferrari way rather than reshaping it. Alain Prost against Ferrari's internal politics, Kimi Räikkönen against their organizational complexity. Even the early years of Michael Schumacher required a radical organizational restructuring before genuine success followed, and Schumacher himself was central to driving that change from the inside. So when credible sources are reporting that Ferrari has fundamentally restructured their suspension geometry, their power unit mapping, their steering wheel interface, their engineering team composition, and their simulator protocols in response to feedback from one driver, that is not a normal Ferrari story. That represents something genuinely different from the institutional behavior we have come to expect from Maranello, and it deserves to be recognized as such. Whether that shift represents a genuinely healthy evolution of a great institution making smart choices about how to maximize the final competitive window of a once-in-a-generation talent, or whether it represents a level of organizational accommodation that introduces its own risks if results do not follow, well, that is a conversation the paddock is apparently having in various forms. I personally lean toward viewing it as mostly healthy and strategically smart, with appropriate caveats. If your most important competitive asset is a 7-time world champion with a finite and shrinking career window, building your machinery around his specific strengths rather than expecting him to overcome fundamental technical incompatibilities through sheer talent is not weakness, it is resource optimization. The alternative is stubborn institutional tradition for its own sake, and in professional motorsport, stubborn tradition does not win championships. Results win championships. But I want to be genuinely honest about what we still do not know, because responsible analysis demands it, and I think viewers deserve honesty about uncertainty. The ultimate and only meaningful test of all these reported changes is whether they make the SF26 faster and more consistent under real race conditions across a full season of 24 events at circuits ranging from Monaco to Monza to Singapore to Silverstone, under varying weather conditions, tire compounds, strategic scenarios, and competitive pressures. Ferrari has a history that includes numerous occasions where significant technical investment and organizational restructuring did not translate into the championship results the team expected. The 2026 regulation reset creates opportunity for every team on the grid simultaneously, Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren, and others have all reportedly approached this regulation cycle with considerable resources, significant engineering talent, and strategic intent. The correlation between reported technical changes during pre-season development and actual race weekend performance over a full championship of 24 events at circuits ranging from Monaco to Monza to Singapore to Silverstone, under varying weather conditions, tire compounds, strategic scenarios, and competitive pressures, is never certain, and anyone presenting it as such is selling you the level of confidence that this sport's history simply does not support. There is another dimension to this story that I think gets lost when people focus purely on the engineering changes, and it is worth spending a moment on because it shapes how we should interpret everything we have discussed. This is fundamentally a story about institutional trust and about how high-performing organizations decide to allocate their greatest resources. Ferrari did not make these reported changes because Lewis Hamilton asked nicely. Organizations like Ferrari do not operate that way. They made these changes because, based on the data Hamilton's team was producing, the engineering logic was compelling enough that resisting it would have been irrational. That distinction matters. The changes are not accommodations in the sense of compromises made to keep a star happy. According to sources, they are responses to technical arguments that Ferrari's own engineers agreed with once they engaged with the evidence seriously. Hamilton did not simply walk into Maranello and say, "Make it like Mercedes." He apparently spent months documenting specific, data-backed cases for why specific changes would make the car faster and more consistent. And Ferrari's engineers, who are not historically known to rolling over under pressure, reportedly engaged with those arguments seriously and found them sound. That is a fundamentally different dynamic from the personality-driven conflicts that have historically derailed partnerships at this team, and it is one reason to be at least cautiously optimistic about what the SF26 might produce. There is also the question of Charles Leclerc, who has been conspicuously absent from this particular discussion so far, and whose situation inside Ferrari's development direction is genuinely interesting. Leclerc has been at Ferrari since 2019, has had to adapt to some of the same organizational and technical frustrations that Hamilton reportedly experienced in 2025, and has reportedly contributed his own extensive feedback to the SF26's development process. How the car that has reportedly been shaped significantly by Hamilton's specific preferences performs for Leclerc, whose driving style has some meaningful differences in terms of corner entry and braking technique, is a question that technical analysts are tracking closely. If the SF26 is as tailored to Hamilton's particular technical demands as sources suggest, that creates an intriguing subplot around whether Leclerc can extract the same level of performance from a car that was reportedly calibrated with different priorities than those he's been developing around for several years. Ferrari, to be clear, has not indicated publicly that the SF26 was built around one driver's preferences over the others, but the details in the reporting raise the question in a way that deserves acknowledgement rather than avoidance. What I find genuinely compelling about this story, though, is not the technical details on their own. It's what those details collectively reveal about the nature of this partnership and what both parties are actually committing to. Lewis Hamilton, at this point in his career, could have simply accepted the considerable financial compensation Ferrari offered, adapted himself as best he could to an existing car, accepted that his peak championship-winning years were behind him, and allowed himself to be celebrated as a legendary figure in a respectable decline. Instead, according to every report and source tracking this story, he has been one of the most technically demanding and analytically engaged forces inside Ferrari's engineering operation since day one. The feedback sessions, the extended simulator work, the engineering structure conversations, the power unit mapping discussions. This is not the behavior of a driver collecting a paycheck in the final chapter of a great story. This is someone who genuinely believes he can compete at the front and is pushing the team to give him the machinery to prove it.
And Ferrari, to their very considerable credit, appears to have responded with genuine institutional investment rather than political noise and carefully managed expectations that lead to nowhere. That combination, one intensely driven and technically sophisticated driver demanding specific and structural change, and one historically proud institution willing to implement that change at a fundamental level, is relatively rare in Formula One. When it works, the results tend to be extraordinary. When it doesn't, it at minimum produces some of the most compelling sport you will ever watch. Either way, the SF26 story is one of the most fascinating technical and human narratives in Formula One right now, and anyone who loves this sport should be paying close attention to how it develops race by race through the 2026 season. Because ultimately, all the suspension geometry and power unit philosophy and simulator correlation in the world only matters when the lights go out at the start of the race and the lap timer begins. And that's the moment we are all watching for.